Welcome back to the second hour of today's program. On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books, including his latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. You can tweet him at Prof Wolff with 2 Fs. He also has a website, rdwolff with 2 Fs.com. Professor Wolff, welcome back, and thanks so much for joining us again. The Republicans and some of the so-called conservative Democrats are out there just freaking out about the national debt, particularly with regard to the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill. I think a lot of the time when those of us in the media talk about the debt, the deficit, the impact of it, how it might or might not cause inflation, all these things, we assume a level of knowledge that most people probably don't actually have. Could you, as a professor of economics, could you give us a little primer on what is the deficit, what is the debt, what is the impact of that debt, and thoughts on this whole modern monetary theory that really the debt is savings, that you have to have a certain amount of national debt, that when Andrew Jackson paid off the entire national debt back in the 1830s, it produced the longest and deepest depression in American history because there was no safe place for people or government to store money in treasuries, and that there is actually an upside to having a national debt. So let me just toss all that in your lap, Professor.
Okay, yes, it isn't all that complicated. Before I start, though, there is just a word. It's shameless what the Republicans are doing. Not that the Democrats are all that much better, but the Republicans, this occasional decision that the national debt is a big problem, when the biggest boost to it was the tax cut of December 2017 and last year's deficit budget by Mr. Trump. I mean, it really boggles the mind that they can get away with this. But having said that, let me answer your question. First, the deficit. Very simple. The government of the United States in Washington, D.C. has to spend money on a whole host of things. The military, Social Security, maintaining roads and bridges more or less, and a whole host of other programs that touch all of us. The way that the government gets the money to spend is by doing one of two things: taxing us, that means we have to give them money, end of story, or borrowing the money from us. The deficit is the amount of money borrowed. In other words, it's simply the difference between the amount of money raised in taxes by Washington relative to the amount of money they spend. If they spend more than what they raise in taxes, there's a deficit. And by the way, if you're interested, if they spend less than they raise in taxes, which has happened, that's called a budgetary surplus. Number two now, the debt. The debt of the United States is the total of all of the deficits our government has ever run, minus whatever portion of that deficit the government paid back. So it's really the deficit is your annual borrowing, and the debt is the total sum of all of that borrowing. Now we get to the question, what are the consequences of a deficit? And here's where ignorance and malevolence meet, because the answer to that question is not possible, because what the impact of a deficit is, or what the impact of a national debt is, depends on all the other things going on in the economy at the same time, because they will determine more than the size of the debt or the size of the deficit what the impact will be. That's why when people either tell you the deficit will cause X, or with equal confidence the deficit will not cause X, both of them are nuts and shouldn't be taken seriously, because they think all of the other things that influence the outcome somehow don't matter, and that's never been true. And I'll give you the simplest example, because that's what's in the news. Sometimes when the government runs a deficit and accumulates a debt, it has the consequence of producing rising prices and inflation. That's right. But there are many examples of the government running a deficit and building up the debt when there's no inflation as a result, which, by the way, was the case for years after the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. The lesson there is not that it's either yes or no, deficits cause inflation. The answer is to recognize what all economics teaches, which is a deficit is simply one of many ongoing events in an economy, and whatever happens after you run a deficit depends as much on all of those other things as it does on the deficit itself.
What are your thoughts on the modern monetary theory proposal that because the Constitution gives the Treasury, not the Fed, which didn't exist back then, but the Treasury Department, gives the Treasury Department the right to to mint coins and to determine their value, that the Treasury could mint, say, $1 trillion platinum coins, say that they're worth $1 trillion each, and then cash those coins in with the Fed and pay down the national debt, but buy a bunch of our bonds with those coins, or however they do it. I don't know. It seems a little too slick by half, but I've had people who explain this stuff on this program, and I can't punch holes in their argument. Tell me about your thoughts on this.
Sure. Let's make sure we all understand how this game is played. The responsibility of funding the government is in the hands of the U.S. Treasury. They're the ones who collect the taxes we pay, who borrow when that's necessary, and who then pay out the checks to pay for what the government undertakes. So the Treasury handles a deficit as follows. If the government's going to spend more than it takes in taxes, it's the Treasury that issues a kind of security. They're called Treasury securities. And depending on for how long this borrowing goes on, they're either a Treasury bill or a Treasury bond. These names don't matter so much, but think of it as IOUs, pieces of paper very carefully printed that say that if you lend money to the government, they will give you in exchange one of these IOUs, paying you interest for the number of years that this debt is for and paying you back at the end. Now, of course, anybody can hold the Treasury security. They will have given their money to the federal government as a loan, and they will now be the proud possessor of the Treasury security. But, and here's the crucial thing, they don't have to do that. These Treasury securities are negotiable. That means you can buy and sell them. And what huge lenders to the United States government normally do, and I'm talking here about banks, large corporations, insurance companies, the big player in lending money to the government, what they usually do is turn around and sell that security. Often within minutes of buying it from the Treasury, they resell it to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve uses its own right to print new money to buy those things. So that's why the Federal Reserve is one of the largest holders of U.S. Treasuries in the world, because it has been printing money and pumping it into the economy by buying the debt that is issued by the Treasury. The minute you understand that, you can see why modern monetary theory asks the question, why are we going through this crazy two-step? Why not let the government, the Treasury and the Fed together, simply print money and use it to let the government do the things we want it to do? Because if you did that, there'd be no debts. There'd be none of this crazy anxiety, and it's very expensive to boot, to go through this indirection of having the Treasury borrow it, only to see the people it borrows from turn around and sell those securities right off to the Fed and bringing new money into the economy that way. And the modern monetary theory are quite right. The government could do that. There's no problem. The only reason we don't have the government do it is that when we have in the past, as we have, allowed governments to do that, it never took very long before people took over the government, right-wingers, left-wingers, in between, and abused the money printing power in ways that made people freak out. And so this device was developed, make them go through this two-step process, which basically allows banks, insurance companies, and big corporations to have an outsized influence, because if they're not willing to lend to the Treasury, this game can't be played. But of course, for the mass of people, this is a shenanigan among the people who run our economy. All the rest of it are left out because there really is little to no democratic control over how any of this is handled.
Wow. So should we be printing trillion-dollar coins or not?
Well, I think the problem is whether we go through the two steps I've described or whether we shift over to modern monetary theory. The only real difference is all of the yowling, usually by people who have an ulterior motive, and they're mostly Republicans, this periodic, convenient yowling over the deficit would stop because the government's spending of money would not involve borrowing.
And that would blow
up. So they
up.
wouldn't have that argument.
Right,
but I'm sure those folks could find other arguments.
Right. That would blow up Jude Wanniski's strategy that he put in the Wall Street Journal back in the 1970s that Reagan adopted, where he said, you know, Republicans going forward, what they should do is whenever they have power, they should spend money like drunken sailors, and then as soon as Democrats come into power, they should scream about the national debt. And they literally...
And that's what they've done.
That's exactly right.
That's what they've
they
done.
have literally adopted...
That's what they've done.
He called it the two Santa Claus theory. He said the Democrats get to play Santa Claus with Social Security and unions and minimum wage. Republicans need to play Santa Claus with tax cuts and force the Democrats to shoot their own Santa Claus by screaming about the debt so that the Democrats are forced to stop spending money. It was brilliant, and it's still going on, as you said. Professor Richard Wolff, democracyatwork.info, rdwolff.com, Prof. Wolff over on Twitter. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Always great talking to you. I always learn something. Thank you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It is.